question. The subcommittee will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. On the eve of the Liberian election, I want to especially thank Congressman Dan Donovan for recommending this important hearing for our subcommittee before those elections, and also to speak to the future of democracy and governance in Liberia. As we all know, of the more than 50 nations in Africa, the United States has the closest connection with the Republic of Liberia. This is not only because Liberia was founded in 1847 by freedmen and former slaves from this country, but also because of the estimated 500,000 Liberians and Liberian descendants who live here. Liberian cities such as Monrovia and Buchanan were named for American presidents. And in part of my district that I had for 30 years before it was redistricted out, the city of Trenton has a very large Liberian diaspora population with whom I got very close and still do a great deal of casework for, even though I don't represent them anymore, because that bond is so strong. However, most Americans are largely unaware of the long link between the United States and Liberia, and likely see Liberia as just another African country. Most Americans are unaware that Liberia has been a major U.S. ally since World War II and into the Cold War, hosting U.S. communications facilities in the 1960s and 1970s, and receiving extensive U.S. development assistance, including post-war aid and Ebola aid to Liberia. The United States has also helped Liberia build its criminal justice sector and supported transitional justice efforts. The U.S. has funded just over a quarter of the cost of UNMEL at a cost of about $106 million annually as of fiscal year 2016. Liberia is also implementing a $256.7 million five-year MCC compact signed in 2015, designed to increase access to reliable, affordable electricity and enhance the country's poor road infrastructure. Bilateral State Department USAID assistance totaled $91 million in FY16. President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has made some advancement in democracy and governing during her 2 terms, and we applaud her for that, following the despotic rule of Charles Taylor. During his term of office, Taylor was accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity as a result of his involvement in the Sierra Leone Civil War from 1991 to 2002. But he was also responsible for serious human rights violations in Liberia as well. Charles Taylor was formally indicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone in 2003, and I would note parenthetically that the chief prosecutor has been before this subcommittee, David Crane, many times and has been provided useful insights as to what we need to do with regards to Syria and war crimes tribunals in another part of the world. All of that information, all of that wisdom gleaned from his work on the Special Court, which not only indicted but prosecuted successfully many, and eventually Charles Taylor, as we all know, got 50 years and is currently serving that sentence at The Hague. The United States occasionally arrested alleged perpetrators of civil rights, human rights abuses, often using immigration perjury charges as a vehicle for prosecution. One of them was Charles MacArthur Emanuel, also known as Chucky Taylor, the son of Charles Taylor. Raised in Florida, Emanuel became the commander of the infamously violent anti-terrorist unit, commonly known as Liberia, as the Demon Forces. He is currently serving a 97-year sentence back in Florida for his role in human rights violations carried out by that so-called anti-terrorist unit. President Sirleaf was unable to, under the Constitution, to run for a 3rd term, but unlike many other leaders around the world, including in Africa, she did not push to change the Constitution to allow a 3rd term. We don't know yet whether her successors can and will continue her upward trend. Most candidates for president have highlighted corruption, but as our witnesses from the National Democratic Institute can tell us, these candidates have platforms that are light on policy specifics. Consequently, today's hearing is intended to examine the prospects for democracy and governance in Liberia following the October elections, which we hope will be free and fair and transparent. The United States is a key provider of technical assistance to Liberia's National Election Commission, including an International Foundation for Electoral Systems program funded by USAID and the UN Development Program, backed by nearly $12 million in mostly European Union funding under a multifaceted project from 2015 to 2018. The Election Commission also receives broader institutional capacity building support under a second $4 million USAID-funded program the Liberian administrative and system strengthening. Our government has a significant investment in Liberia on several fronts. The future direction of this important country is important to the United States. Therefore, we have a stake in the next government, building on the advances made in democracy and governance, again, under President Sirleaf Johnson Sirleaf. Most of all, there must be much more done to minimize the impact of corruption in Liberia. It is a serious issue, and hopefully our government, working in tandem with a new government, will really do a major effort along those lines. I'd like to yield to our distinguished ranking member, Mrs. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and especially for this timely hearing, considering that we are a few weeks away from an election in Liberia. So on October 10th, we know that Liberians will select a new president, vice president, and members of their House. The upcoming elections mark an important moment for the country because they're expected to lead to the country's first electoral transfer of power. And before we delve into democracy, governance, and the future of Liberia, I actually wanted to take a moment to highlight Madam Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as she ends her second term as in presidency. It was such an international event when she became the first female president on the continent of Africa. In 2005, she was charged with the seemingly insurmountable challenge of building a country impacted by 14 years of civil war where more than 200,000 people were killed. Most of the national infrastructure was destroyed and the country was burdened by enormous debt. I remember when President Johnson Sirleaf came to the United States and to the House many times when Power Africa was established, because if you remember, Liberia was not included in the Power Africa proposal, and she walked the halls of Congress until that was changed, and Liberia was included. During her 12 years of the presidency, a decade of sanctions was lifted and deemed no longer necessary. The economy has drastically improved and averaged more than 7% annual growth. Per capita income has risen from a low point of just $80 at the end of the Second Civil War in 2003 to $700, even though the population has increased by nearly 50% to just under 5 million people, and life expectancy is up from 53 to 61 years. And I think that is particularly remarkable given the setback that the Ebola crisis presented. And the Ebola crisis was certainly an example of what happens when the health infrastructure deteriorates, how that disease spread so quickly, but yet the country rebounded in spite of it. And we know that the country has also made great progress in rebuilding its infrastructure and its democratic institutions. And finally, President Sirleaf has been a strong proponent of equal rights for women and a champion for youth. We all applaud and acknowledge her hard work, which has also been recognized by the international community, most notably when she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I also want to point out, I was in Ghana in January for the inauguration of the president, and President Johnson Sirleaf was there as the head of ECOWAS, and to see the leadership that she took as the head of ECOWAS in resolving the conflict in the Gambia, which certainly could have deteriorated in a terrible way. Returning to the topic of this hearing, which is to consider the future of democracy and governance in Liberia, I want to highlight that another extremely important and final act that the President will take is to adhere to Liberia's Constitution and step aside in order to allow the democratic process to continue as the people of Liberia choose their next president. I'm happy to say also that President Johnson Sirleaf will be here next Friday as part of the annual legislative conference of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, and we look forward to her remarks that she will make in a presentation a week from Friday in the morning. I was honored to be a part of Ned's delegation, NDI's delegation to Kenya to observe the election. I'm sorry I won't be able to participate this time in October, but and I look forward to hearing from the representative from the National Endowment for Democracy, who I'm sure will talk about the upcoming observations. I'm also glad to see that we have an acting assistant secretary. We've all been worried about that for a while, and an acting assistant administrator to USAID, so I look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bass. I'd like to yield to Dan Donovan.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield my time for, I am going to chair the second panel. I'll do my opening statement.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
That'd be great. Thanks. I'd like to welcome our two distinguished witnesses, and certainly Donald Yamamoto is no stranger to this subcommittee and to the work that he will be speaking to, and I want to thank him for his leadership. He is the Acting Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs at State. He also served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs from 03-06, where he was responsible for coordinating U.S. policy towards more than 20 countries in East and Central Africa. He served as our ambassador to Ethiopia from 2006 to 2009, and also the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Djibouti from 2000 to 2003, and was the Deputy Director for East African Affairs from 98 to 2000. He has, again, testified several times before this committee, and again, we thank him for his service. Then Cheryl Anderson. Welcome, Ms. Anderson, who's the Acting Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Africa at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Ms. Anderson has more than 20 years of development experience, mostly in Africa. Before joining USAID as a Foreign Service Officer, she worked in USAID missions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Uganda, Sudan, and East Africa. Prior to joining USAID, she worked as a Program Manager for HealthLink Worldwide and also served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana. Mr. Secretary, if you could begin.
Thank you very much. I'd like to submit the longer form for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thanks. Representative Smith, thank you very much. Congresswoman Bass and Congressman Donovan, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be back here today. Good afternoon. Although the 2014-15 Ebola epidemic had a massive human impact and slowed economic growth worldwide, the response led by the United States helped Liberia overcome Ebola and return the country to the path of building confidence. It is hard to overstate the enormity of the challenge President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf inherited in 2005. We applaud the respect she has demonstrated for Liberia's Constitution throughout her tenure and the positive example she has set for the continent of Africa by her unbending respect for presidential term limits. Next month, Liberia's citizens will go to the polls to facilitate Liberia's first peaceful transition of power between democratically elected leaders since 1944. Despite how far Liberia has come, many challenges remain that will fall to President Sirleaf's successor to address. On the elections and security, the presidential candidates vying to replace President Sirleaf have been campaigning vigorously since the start of the formal campaign period at the end of July. We are pleased that 20 registered political parties declared their commitment to a peaceful electoral process, and many of them reaffirmed this commitment on the margins of the ECOWAS summit in June 2017. While the United States does not support any specific party or candidate, we are pleased to see a robust participation in this election. Liberians from all walks of life are aware of the importance of these elections, and the United States stands by those committed to support a peaceful, credible, and transparent electoral process. Despite very real challenges, President Sirleaf and her administration are committed to conducting a peaceful, credible, and transparent election. The government has also taken steps to build systems and processes led by the Governance Commission for the handover of power that will occur in January 2018. There are significant challenges still facing the National Electoral Commission, notably poor infrastructure, inadequate funding, heavy rain that could complicate election logistics. However, we are encouraged that the NSC successfully carried out a free and fair legislative by-election this past February. We are providing comprehensive program support to the Liberian National Election Commission, civil society organizations, media outlets in the run-up to the 2017 elections. In addition, our ambassadors meeting with candidates running for president to emphasize the importance of peaceful elections in a transitioning government that builds upon the progress made in the last 12 years. As UNMIL looks to close out its mandate at the end of March 2018, it should be considered a success story. It has kept the peace and gradually but steadily transferred key responsibilities back to the government. The UN mission to Liberia, presented as mandated notably to protect civilians, advise the Liberian National Police on election security, and promote sustainable peace through radio stations. Since July 2016, the government of Liberia has been fully responsible for the internal security, and we have no discernible change in the society situation since then. A joint security task force chaired by the Liberian National Police is also actively overseeing election security planning. This is a positive sign for prospects of maintaining peace and stability during the electoral period. On the governance, the next president of Liberia will inherit a more stable and secure Liberia than that which President Sirleaf inherited in 2005. While some drivers of instability have diminished, others will need continued attention. These include deficiencies in the administration of justice, official corruption, land disputes, intertribal, interethnic, and interreligious tensions, poverty coupled with income disparity, and a large youth population disproportionately affected by unemployment. Liberia has come a long way in rebuilding state institutions after years of conflict. Nevertheless, the gains are fragile, and there is still room for much improvement. Official and systemic corruption drains limited public resources, deters investment and contributions to a culture in which working in government can be perceived more as a route to self-enrichment than public service. There is continued need to strengthen institutions critical to democratic governance to ensure improvements are sustained. As we look ahead, I can assure you the United States remains steadfast in the support for the people of Liberia in their efforts to consolidate further democratic gains, ensure the government remains accountable to its citizens, reduce corruption, ensure the responsible stewardship of scarce public resources. And with that, I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Ms. Anderson.
Good afternoon, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Bass, Congressman Donovan. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I appreciate your continued interest in how U.S. policies and assistance programs can help Liberians consolidate a peaceful and stable democracy in which prosperity is available to all. USAID's development partnership with Liberia dates back to our founding in 1961. As the largest bilateral donor in Liberia, today the United States plays an influential role in many aspects of the country's development. Our programs address the underlying structural and institutional problems that gave rise to 14 years of civil strife and war, while at the same time tackling the country's more immediate development needs and challenges. As a new government is formed, following the upcoming elections, the United States will build strategically on the current strong relationship. We will identify opportunities to enhance transparency, strengthen checks and balances, and support Liberians both inside and outside of government institutions. This includes our work with the nation's next generation of democratic leaders. If successful, this election will result in the country's first peaceful, democratically elected transition of power in more than 70 years, marking a critical milestone in the country's progress toward a stable democracy. Recent USAID assessments indicate that citizens are excited about the election and remain actively engaged in the political process. While the campaign period has proceeded smoothly to date, with political parties and candidates conducting themselves peacefully, the National Elections Commission is still fairly limited in its capacity. There may be logistical challenges exacerbated by the limited infrastructure across the country, especially given the timing of the elections during the rainy season. USAID continues to support elections preparations, including support to address necessary preparation that's facing the National Elections Commission. This support has 3 core pillars. The first improves the performance, transparency, and accountability of the Commission, which in turn builds public confidence in the elections. Second, we support citizen participation in electoral processes as voters, as activists, and as candidates. And third, we strengthen civil society and media monitoring of the electoral process. USAID has partnered with local media and civil society organizations, including youth, women, and trade unions, to educate first-time and hard-to-reach voters about the stakes in the 2017 elections and encourage their peaceful participation. Also, we continue to build the communication capacity of the Elections Commission. This includes support for regular meetings between the Commission and political parties to share information and to help resolve electoral issues before they escalate. USAID supported domestic and international observation missions, continue to provide reports on the pre-electoral process. The Sirleaf administration remains publicly committed to conducting a free, fair, and transparent election in October and to an orderly transition of power to the incoming administration. USAID remains committed to partnering with Liberia during that transition. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge and thank you for the critical support provided by Congress through the United States Emergency Assistance to Liberia during and after the Ebola epidemic. With donors' support, the government was able to control the epidemic, which many predicted would have been far worse. We must continue to invest in strengthening institutions to further improve public administration and communication functions at national and local levels, and to enable citizens to hold their government accountable. This will enable the government to respond to potential future emergencies and ensure the cooperation of the public in adhering to public health guidance. In summary, we believe that the government of Liberia can create conditions for a credible electoral process from the pre-election period through the transparent tabulation and announcement of results. USAID will continue to support these efforts. We will urge the newly elected administration to consolidate democratic gains through effective and accountable governance that is responsive to the citizens and to adhere to the rule of law. This includes developing and utilizing systems that reduce opportunities for corruption and waste of limited public resources. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee for the continued commitment you have shown to the Liberian people. I welcome any questions you might have.
Ms. Anderson, thank you very much for your testimony. Just a few opening questions. One, you talked about the reports on the pre-election progress. Are those reports encouraging? Are they showing a willingness, for example, of the various candidates? I know a state has met with the Liberian candidates to adhere to the rule of law. If they don't like the outcome, to adhere to the outcome, providing it was free, fair, and transparent. What have those reports suggested? That we're on track for a good election, or are there some warning signs? Ambassador?
Through the reporting coming in from Ambassador Christine Elder and her teams, they've been in close contact with the National Electoral Commission and also with President Johnson Sirleaf, who has a big stake in ensuring that this is the next elections are free, fair, and transparent and accountable to the people. So far, everything looks on track. Obviously, from the Carter report, NDI report, and also our own reports, there are challenges and problems ahead, but overall, it looks to be on target. We have over 28,000, of course, poll workers being trained through AID and IFIS, and of course, we're looking carefully at all of the over 5,360 polling areas to make sure that they're appropriate. I think one of the big factors will be the rains. If it rains, how people are going to get to the polling. That's going to be a challenge, given that only 7% of paved roads in Liberia. But it is on target.
Okay. Let me ask you, with the UN mission in Liberia, which we all know has played an integral part in disarming the more than 100,000 former combatants, it has trained and professionalized Liberia's police force to ensure law and order and to advance women's participation in government and civil society. With UNMIL drawing down currently and on track to be entirely out next year, how well do you think the government will be, the bureaucracy, and of course, who heads the government will be extremely important, to handle security on its own, especially since some of the candidates have poor records of human rights? We don't know who's going to win. We don't take sides, but there is a concern, I have it at least, and I'm sure others do as well, about some people who have had very poor records of human rights who could be head of state.
And the program for UNMIL has been a success story.
Yeah.
And their extension past the election was really on to ensure that there remains confidence in the process. The issue is that it's been on target to remove the heavy token force now, and I think they've done their mission. And it's really up to the Liberian security forces. In our last elections and currently, we assess that the defense force as well as the police still need training and guidance and mentoring. We will be on top of that. The 2,000 troops and over 600 police. But I think right now is our reports are that they are up to the target to meet the needs. And again, we will continue to be there. This remains a priority even after UNMIL leaves.
Let's just ask you briefly about the ability to register and vote. Are we convinced that the process is, again, transparent, so that people who have signed up will find out when they show up at the polls, there's their name, they can, make their selection and have confidence it will be counted correctly?
I think we can be relatively optimistic now. We've been through the voter registration period. With our support, I think we've seen fairly good turnout on the voter registration, with an emphasis on hard-to-reach voters, first-time voters, and also on women voters. I can tell you that one of the kind of new technologies that we've supported is that Liberians can now use their cell phones, and many of them do have cell phones, and put in a message that includes their voter registration ID number, and then get a message back, boop, that tells them where's the location for them to go and vote.
And just to add to that is, again, the appeal process. And we have been working very closely with President Johnson Sirleaf on the judicial process and due process. And if there is any problems expressed by the candidates or one of the candidates, then that will be addressed quickly and efficiently and effectively, we hope, and will be there by the NEC and also the judicial process.
And last question before going to Ms. Bass. Obviously, Ebola, and the work that was done, just nothing but kudos for the great work that you guys did, the administration did, the military deployment, all of it was just textbook on how to try to mitigate a crisis from killing even more people. We know Ebola's not gone. Are we convinced that we have early warning capabilities that should it reemerge, that it could be quickly mitigated and hopefully eliminated?
Shall I go ahead? First of all, thank you for the generous support and guidance on the Ebola response. There hasn't been a new case in Liberia in a year and a half, and we certainly recognize that countries with weak health systems and with low confidence in the public, in their public health systems, that was where we had the big problems. So this is no time for complacence. We have invested significant resources in the health systems, and we are also building the citizens' confidence in their own services. So I think there have been several recent outbreaks, Lassa fever and cholera, where we were quite worried about spread, and the Liberian public health system has been able to detect them through their surveillance system and successfully managed to control them. So our efforts really are to help the public health system prevent, detect, and respond to disease, and we will continue that.
Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, I can't overemphasize the great work that you have done, and of course, Congresswoman Bass, because you really highlighted a lot of the issues and challenges and really brought forth the things that we really need to focus on, and it's really brought the international community focused on this, and also all our groups. And more important is the emphasis that you have all placed on institution building, democratic values, and really through this strong institutions, we can guarantee and support anything that happens, pandemics or famines or other issues. And so thank you very much for your great work.
Again, thank you, Mr. Ambassador and Ms. Anderson, for the great work you guys did. It's all about teamwork, and I think this is one of those times where everyone came together and united to ensure that innocent people were not, obviously, had succumbed to that horrible and dreaded disease. Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, since you were talking about infrastructure, it's very good to hear that there has not been any new cases of Ebola. When I was in Liberia in August of last year, they were concerned about relapse or it being transmitted after, the fact. And so hearing that there haven't been any new cases is really good. Not quite on our topic, but since you were talking about infrastructure, I was just wondering what more you think needs to be done now, post-Ebola, in terms of the health infrastructure.
I referred to my colleague just on the basic programs that we're going to do on health, but I think overall is simple things, the power generation, the MCC, and the $257 million electrification. When we were out there in Liberia when Charles Taylor was transitioning out, there was no electricity, and we were just amazed and shocked that this could ever happen, and it has. And thanks to you for the MCC program, et cetera. The other issue, too, part of the MCC has been paved roads, really to bring the rural and the urban together, but more important is to get access to those in the rural areas, to bring them back to for rapid treatment, et cetera. So those are things to bring the country together, and I think those are the infrastructure. The other issue, too, of course, obviously, is economic development and raising capacity building, particularly in the health sector. But I turn to my colleague on other issues.
Hello.
I agree that our emphasis has to be on building local capacity so that Liberians can define their own future and their own path forward. There's a lot more work to be done, obviously, in the infrastructure and in the capacity and training of the individuals in the public health system. At the same time, working to mitigate corruption and waste in governance, and also building the capacity of Liberian institutions to hold their government accountable to the people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I wanted to ask you now about U.S. government assistance to Liberia, in particular in the area of good governance and democratization. And you could address that both from the USAID perspective and others. So wanting you to describe the continuity and change in U.S. policy toward Liberia between our two administrations and what is proposed in the budget around democracy and governance and where we are, and if that has impacted what we're doing in Liberia today. And I believe, Mr. Ambassador, you were mentioning, I think you mentioned poll workers that have been supported by our funding, but I didn't quite hear what you said in terms of the number.
Yeah. So right now, it's over 28,000 poll workers are being trained. Obviously, one of the problems for the NSC is to get those numbers and also the training. But I defer to AID since it's coming from AID and IFAS.
Okay.
We have a long-standing partnership with Liberia, and Liberia will continue to be a relative priority for us. Democracy, rights, and governance is an important element of our programming in Liberia, and it's really been an area of emphasis, working on governance, public financial management, building the capacity of the judiciary, working especially on anti-corruption, supporting civil society and the media. And our aim really, as I said, is a government that's responsive and accountable to its citizens. And we will continue this into the next administration in Liberia.
So one concern that some of us have begun to have on the Hill is, one, there are the proposed cuts, and obviously that's still working its way through the process. But whether or not in USAID you will be allowed to spend money that has already been allocated, as opposed to slowing that process down, because we've heard that in terms of the expenditures that are not being, really implemented, is one question. I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah, I think we are still continuing to be responsible for delivering development results with the funding that's already been appropriated. And as we go forward, if the levels are reduced, we'll just have to make sure that we are increasingly using our money more efficiently and more effectively.
And so you got what I was saying. I mean,
Yes, I did.
not the future, money that's already there.
Yes.
And are you free to spend it? And I don't know if you're involved at all with the famine effort, but, we allocated close to $1 billion, and we're hearing that that's being slow-walked. It's an emergency, and so is it getting out of the door, or is it being held back, and will it be carried over into the next fiscal year? I'm saying that in reference to famine, but we've heard that about the democracy funding as well.
Can I have one more point, Madam Congresswoman? So we've dedicated about $2 billion since 2003, and if you look at the last 10 years, it's about $1.5 billion. But overall, the aid assistance, even towards the end of the last administration, was going down. So the question comes in is for us, we're looking at dwindling resources across the board, but Liberia for us remains a priority country. We still have, as you know, 3 bilateral commissions, and of course, Liberia becomes the 4th, and that's critical, and that's because of the work Johnson Sirleaf has done and then all the good results she has gone through, and we want to continue that. So long as we're here, we're going to continue to commit to that. I mean, just looking at our own assistance as far as assistance to military training, to other areas, yes, it's probably going to take some cuts, but the issue is that the commitment is still there, and it continues into the next fiscal year. I can't say what the amounts are going to be exactly. We'll have to come back to you once those numbers are defined, but to assure you that for us, as long as we're here, that is a priority country.
Okay, so I hear you say that the commitment is there, and commitment without resources is a little shallow, but I also hear you saying that you are able to expend the money that is being allocated. Is the famine money spent?
Do you want to? Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Be happy to get back to you on that.
Would you? I would appreciate that. I would appreciate that. And so then my final question is, what are we prepared to do after the election? I mean, as I mentioned, I was in Kenya and I thought everything went well. Kind of went awry after the fact. But it's one thing to get through the election, then what are we prepared to do after the election?
So the election is an event, and from there comes really the hard work, is how to ensure that the democratic procedures and processes that President Johnson Sirleaf has really put in efforts to during her 2 terms, that they will continue, that we won't see a backtrack. Then the other issue too is that we need to continue to strengthen the NEC, the legal process and procedures, because that's going to be very important to how we do the structures afterwards. And again, we'll be visiting Liberia constantly. Our ambassadors will be committed. We're going to look at, do we have to, what areas do we need to emphasize and stress? We're going to be continuing to do on MCC, Power Africa, and also EWEP, the Girls' Education and Women's Entrepreneur, which is our 2 most important and really changing of societal programs. And then we're going to look much more closely too at economic development to see how we can address the needs of the 50% youth and high unemployment rates in Liberia.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. Mr. Ambassador, the State Department has met with the candidates, the Liberian candidates that are running for election. How confident are you that this relationship between our 2 countries will continue in the next government, particularly when you look at some of the human rights concerns that many Liberians have about some of the candidates?
So I'd like to answer that in two ways. First is that the results of those elections are by the people of Liberia themselves. And I don't think that the people of Liberia are ever going to go back to a regression of what it was prior to Johnson Sirleaf. And the commitments and the developments that have been made, I think the people are committed to those trend lines. The second area, too, is that you have a large Liberian diaspora in the United States. I think they're very vocal. They'll keep us on our toes if we're not focused on those issues. And my message to not only the diaspora, but to the people of Liberia is that we are still committed to ensuring that the results after the elections will be as strong and as robust and continue because this remains a priority country.
Wonderful, thank you. Jewel Taylor is the former wife of Charles Taylor, current senator and the vice presidential candidate, and she was reportedly in the United States this year advocating for the release of her husband, her former husband, from prison. Can you tell us what efforts were being made about Senator Taylor's imprisonment and our efforts to have him released?
I mean, Charles Taylor.
Yes.
Okay. He's in jail for the long term. We have not made any efforts to seek any change or adjustment to the due process and what was adjudicated by the court systems.
Okay. Had his wife met with folks from the state? Do you know at all?
We don't normally comment on people, but let me just say, yes, we did. We did meet with Joel Howard Taylor, and those conversations, I think, are between us.
We totally understand,
Yeah.
Mr. Ambassador. Thank you.
But believe me, messages were passed.
Great, thank you. Ms. Anderson, USAID is working with other international organizations such as the UN and other partners to ensure that the election process in Liberia next month is smooth, credible, and peaceful. What more should the United States be doing, leveraging partnerships that we have with others to help ensure a successful outcome of the election?
I think that coordination right now is very important, and we are putting a big effort on coordinating our efforts with other stakeholders in the process, including other development partners, donors. Up until now, we're cautiously optimistic. We're reading the reports that are coming in. I agree with Ambassador Yamamoto that we are concerned about the logistics and the relatively weak capacity of the Elections Commission. It's still a work in progress, especially in light of the infrastructure and the rainy season. So one of the things that we've been working on with the commission is communications, because we have seen in other elections, sometimes that's where things break down. If there's a problem, if there's a delay, people start to get nervous, and if the commission is not talking about what's happening, even if it's a mistake or a problem, that communication is very important. So we have been working with them on that. At this point, I think maybe the only other thing I would mention would be there is a limited police presence outside of the capital, Monrovia, and we are keeping an eye on that. I know that the Japanese government, the Liberian government was asking for additional funding to be able to deploy the police that they've been training so that they can actually go out to the polling station locations. The Japanese government recently put in a $1.1 million contribution to that.
I see. Thank you. My last question is, I know USAID is managing 2 different programs on the elections in Liberia extending to next year, but at some point those programs are going to end. What's our confidence level that once those 2 programs' lifetime has expired, the skills of the Liberian election officials to carry on all the work that you have done for all this length of time?
I think you will hear more about that in the next panel with probably more detail than I can give, but our emphasis has been on building local capacity because it's the Liberians' responsibility to run their elections, to monitor them, and to participate in those elections. So our emphasis has been on training and also anticipating problems to help the commission deal with issues before they escalate into big crises. We will have to see what the future brings in terms of future elections.
I thank you both, Mr. Ambassador and Ms. Anderson. I thank you for your testimony, your insight, and for your forthcoming answers to our questions. This panel is now adjourned. We'll give a 1-minute break to allow the next panel to come up. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you.
I'd like to take a moment now to thank Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Bass for holding this hearing. I'd like to also welcome and thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I would especially like to welcome my constituent and good friend, Dr. Aurelia Curtis, along with her husband, Al, and her family. Thank you for making this trip all the way down. Now you know what I go through every week. I know Dr. Curtis since my days of serving as Chief of Staff to then Staten Island Borough President Guy Molinari, where she was then the principal of Curtis High School, and that's how good we are in New York. We name our high schools after our principals. I asked Dr. Curtis to be a witness here today because of her unique perspective as someone who has been an integral part of the Liberian community in the United States. For those of you who may not know it, Staten Island is home to the largest concentration of Liberians outside of Western Africa. One of the many things that I have learned from Dr. Curtis and our local Liberian community is their dedication to highlighting the importance of freedom, liberty, and democracy, because they have seen firsthand the turbulence and chaos that arises when these principles are not upheld. In recent years, Liberia has made strides in advancing its democratic and development efforts, but we must recognize the challenges that we face ahead. In less than a month, Liberia will hold elections that will test the nation's democratic strength and stability. This is an opportunity for the country to make history by allowing the Liberian people to experience their first post-war democratic transfer of power. Looking to the future, it is this subcommittee's intention to ensure that Liberia is able to further build a strong, peaceful, and democratic nation. We are fortunate to have a panel of experts, including Dr. Curtis, that will examine some of the issues I touched on, as well as other important topics. I look forward to hearing their insights, as well as having thoughtful discussions to help put into place policies that will ensure Liberia's future as a stable democracy and strengthen the United States-Liberian relationships. I now yield to the Ranking Member, Ms. Karen Bass.
Mr. Chair, I will defer my comments until the panel has spoken.
Wonderful. I'd like to introduce our panel. David Peterson is Senior Director of the National Endowment for Democracy. Since 1988, he has been responsible for NED's program to identify and assist African NGOs. He was formerly Executive Director of Project South Africa of the A. Philip Randolph Education Fund and a freelance journalist in Africa and Turkey. He has visited more than 40 African countries and is an expert in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Aurelia Curtis is the founder of the Weeks Educational and Social Advocacy Project, Incorporated. It is based in Staten Island, New York, and Liberia. As a key conduit between Liberia and the Liberian diaspora community in the United States, this agency's mission is to increase access to better education opportunities, expand social development, and improve health care for the community. Dr. Curtis, as I said, was also the principal of Curtis High School in Staten Island, which has the largest concentration of Liberians outside of Western Africa. Rashdi Nakardian is the International Foundation Electoral Systems Regional Director for Africa, a founding member of what was the Electoral Leadership Institute. He was focused on electoral reform, capacity development, strategic planning, project and program evaluation, and expert advice in elections and development of e-learning materials with a special focus on Africa. Additionally, he has guided the African Union in revising their election observation approach and has worked in numerous African countries, such as Senegal, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Dr. Chris Fumuyo is the current Senior Associate and Regional Director of the Central and West Africa at the National Democratic Institute. He has organized and advised international election observation missions and designed and supervised country-specific democratic support programs with civic organizations, political parties, and legislative bodies throughout Central and West Africa. He recently designed and helped launch the African Statesman Initiative, a program aimed at facilitating political transitions in Africa by encouraging former democratic heads of state. He is also an adjunct faculty. He is also an adjunct faculty member at the African Center for Strategic Studies and a former adjunct professor of African politics and government at Georgetown University. On behalf of this subcommittee, I welcome you all. And at this point, I recognize Mr. Peterson for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Donovan and Ranking Member Bass. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to testify this afternoon. Liberia has come a long way in the 30 years since the National Endowment for Democracy began working there in the waning years of the Samuel Doe regime. Through the Civil War, the interim government, the rule of Charles Taylor, and now 2 terms of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and the Ebola crisis. Liberia's October 10 election should be competitive, peaceful, and democratic. But Liberia's democracy should not be taken for granted. Having observed both the 1997 elections that brought Taylor to power, as well as the 2005 elections that ushered in Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, I can testify to the determination Liberians have demonstrated for democracy at the ballot box. According to Afrobarometer, 83% of Liberians support democratic elections. That's a very high level internationally. The reports from our Liberian partners in the field describe lively candidate debates, successful voter registration efforts, massive civic education campaigns. They're mobilizing youth, women, traditional leaders, security forces, among others, to inform them about the process and the candidates and to participate responsibly. They're using social media, phone banks, community town halls, radio, and even old-fashioned town criers to spread the word. They're monitoring the process, providing criticism and recommendations, and some are working directly to support the Electoral Commission. According to one of our partners, campaigning has been peaceful and mature, even in the most troubled areas. As they say, candidates and their campaign managers have been keen on the issues and things they can do to improve livelihoods and environments of their people, as opposed to indulging in ethnic politics. But we all know that democracy is more than elections, and the challenges of governance in the interim can be daunting. Predicting the future is dangerous, especially when it comes to the volatile politics of West Africa, but Liberia could prove to be a reliable democratic partner of the United States. Its democratic institutions and popular commitment to democracy could grow stronger, and its governance could improve. How can this happen? Liberia is not the only country in West Africa holding democratic elections. Ghana's elections last year were a model of efficiency and transparency, as well as being peaceful and democratic. The Gambia's elections last year were also competitive and produced a surprising transition. In the last few years, Senegal, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, Mali, and of course Nigeria have held elections of varying quality, but all essentially free and democratic. Sierra Leone and Guinea will hold elections next year, which are also anticipated to be democratic. Thus, in this regional context, Liberia is fortunate to be surrounded by democratic-minded neighbors who are more likely to support Liberia's democratic trajectory than to subvert it. The kinds of cross-border attacks that used to occur back and forth between Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Cote d'Ivoire have ended. The steady withdrawal of UN and ECOWAS troops is not a sign of fatigue or diminished support, but of confidence that Liberia's own security institutions are strong enough to maintain order and protect the country. All of these governments are friendly to the United States, and as their democratic systems consolidate and mature, the entire West Africa region should come to be regarded as an important economic and political partner of the United States. But Liberia is special. As Congressman Smith has already noted, although its population is only about 4.3 million, it's the only country in Africa that claims a special kinship to the United States. America's stepchild, as some Liberians put it. Its history is closely intertwined with ours, from the founding of the American Colonization Society in 1822, independence in 1847, the long dominance of the Americo-Liberian elite Its service as an American base during World War II and the Cold War, to place names such as Monrovia, the Liberian flag, the uniquely American accented Liberian English. Liberia's political upheavals have brought waves of Liberian immigrants, as you've already noted, to the United States. And obviously you're very familiar with their energetic lobbying for the issues that they're concerned about. Most Liberians have long aspired for their nation to have a special relationship with the United States. Liberia's economic resources and commercial potential are also not to be dismissed, including rubber and palm oil, iron, tourism, and shipping. I've run out of time. Whoever is elected president of Liberia will be keenly aware of these relationships and will likely want to strengthen them and take advantage of them. But the United States also stands to benefit from a strong, prosperous, and democratic Liberia. In contrast to its destabilizing role in the region just 20 years ago, Liberia is now serving as a model for democratic transition, female leadership, and national reconciliation. In the struggle against extremists and criminal networks in West Africa, Liberia could prove particularly helpful. Liberia's democratic institutions are in place and functioning, but they need shoring up. The legislature, for example, is improving its performance according to one of our partners that's been monitoring it for many years, but it has not always shown the independence and integrity that Liberians expect. Only 1/3 of Liberian voters believe that members of their House of Representatives reflect their views, according to the Afrobarometer. And one of the popular issues in the campaign has been to cut legislators' rather generous salaries and benefits. The legislature's budget is almost equivalent to that of the entire education system in the country. Likewise, Liberia's judiciary remains weak. The Supreme Court's recent rulings of the eligibility of certain candidates have stirred controversy and questions about its independence. Having seen the critical role that the court played in the Kenyan elections, Liberians are skeptical that their own court would be able to show the same integrity. Liberia's local justice structures suffer from a shortage of magistrates and a lack of resources for police and prisons. Some Liberians have criticized the special court that tried Charles Taylor because their own justice system has received so little support. I will leave the discussion about the Electoral Commission to my colleagues. I think they're a better place to comment on that, but it is an important institution. I should just say that Liberia's press remains independent and lively despite resource problems. The anti-defamation cases have tapered off, and new Freedom of Information Act has also been an important advance. Civil society is very vibrant and often critical. It played a leading role in fighting Ebola and will continue to act as a watchdog as well as a partner with government when possible. The labor movement and the business sector have been gaining strength and have been partners with our own Solidarity Center and Center for National Private Enterprise. These non-governmental institutions are fundamental for the success of Liberian democracy. Corruption obviously remains the weak point in Liberia's democracy, as for many African democracies. Nepotism, ethnic favoritism, shady contracts, vote buying, land deals, other forms of both grand and petty corruption can only undermine popular support for democracy and must be opposed. Although the candidates in the election have expressed their readiness to fight corruption, as has President Johnson Sirleaf herself, Liberians have seen very little progress. Liberia must overcome many other challenges to consolidate its nascent democracy. The struggling economy, massive unemployment, dependence on the informal sector, ethnic conflict, religious conflict, land conflict, women's rights, environmental destruction. It's quite an agenda. But I remain optimistic that with political will, popular commitment, and some modest assistance from international partners, Liberia can consolidate its democracy and steadily improve its governance. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. We are honored to be joined by Chairman Ed Royce, who's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, in which this subcommittee is part of. The chair now recognizes Dr. Curtis for her opening statement.
Presiding Chair, my Congressman. Presiding Chair, my Congressman Donovan, Ranking Member Bass, and members of the subcommittee, I thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today about the role of the diaspora in Liberia's ongoing struggle for democracy. The military coup in 1980 followed by the horrific Civil War in 1989, which lasted almost 15 years, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and significantly destroyed much of the infrastructure of Liberia. A notable consequence of the war was the mass exodus of Liberians seeking refuge wherever doors were open. The United States of America opened its doors, and the borough of Staten Island in New York City became home to the largest concentration of Liberians outside of West Africa. The Staten Island diaspora remains the center of culture and connections for Liberians across the United States, optimistic that we will be an integral part of the rebuilding of Liberia, ensuring that it is indeed a land of liberty. The past 12 years of peaceful governance is a foundation that all Liberians must build upon. My name is Dr. Aurelia Nekonti Louise Weeks Curtis, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Weeks Educational and Social Advocacy Project, WESAP. I thank you, Congressman Donovan, for the gracious introduction. I have worked for many nonprofit causes, but WESAP, with offices in the United States and Liberia, now claims most of my time and attention. WESAP has connected amputee children in Liberia with resources in the U.S., offering them prosthetic limbs. When the children return to Liberia, WESAP ensures that they are enrolled in school, providing all tuition fees, books, and uniforms. A local social worker is a liaison between WESAP students and families, supporting youth development and other family needs. WESAP has launched a campaign to put water wells near schools in Liberia that have no fresh water supply, and is in partnership with 2 US-based nonprofits to establish an all-girl boarding school in Liberia. With the support of the Staten Island community, we assist families, especially immigrants and refugees from population groups that are not commonly represented in our area. We provide multi-ethnic and culturally sensitive services that address their needs with respect and dignity. Recently, WESAP advocated for and assisted a family to return the mortal remains of their daughter to the United States for burial. Princess Yates, a U.S. citizen born to Liberian parents on Staten Island, went to Liberia on July 4th to celebrate her grandmother's 90th birthday. She was involved in a tragic automobile accident. According to published reports, the local hospital refused to give her needed medical assistance because money was not readily available to pay for treatment. Her mother cried. Princess sat in an abandoned wheelchair, begging for help, until she took her last breath. This incident highlights the critical need for timely access to good health care, especially in a country like Liberia, with a high level of poverty, whose infrastructure was decimated by the Civil War. Following the forthcoming elections, all Liberians must play a role indispensable to ensuring geometric growth in access to health care and other urgent facets of sustainable development in Liberia. Dual citizenship. Liberians in the diaspora often wonder if they are in fact welcome to participate in the rebuilding of Liberia. Primary doubt stems from the lack of clarity regarding dual citizenship. The Supreme Court of Liberia recently heard a case brought by Alvin Jallow, a United States citizen born in Liberia to Liberian parents, who fled Liberia as a direct result of the Civil War. He immigrated to the United States and subsequently acquired U.S. citizenship in accordance with the naturalization laws of this country. Chapter 22 of the Alien and Nationality Law of Liberia, quote, prohibits Liberian citizens from taking other nationalities or engaging in certain acts in foreign countries, unquote, including armed forces enlistment and participation in elections. Liberians in the diaspora are watching this case closely because the wrong decision will have dire implications for the talent pool that is ready to return and assist in nation building. A decision in this case has not been rendered, but wait! The Supreme Court may have already ruled in this matter when it failed to prevent several candidates in the forthcoming elections from contesting when evidence was presented to prove that said candidates had naturalized citizenship in other countries. I call on this subcommittee, to use its influence to assist the people that you represent, Liberians in the United States of America, to attain dual citizenship, an initial hurdle that can be an impediment to tapping into the valuable human resource pool that resides outside of Liberia, a country in great need. Liberians in the diaspora stand willing and ready to assist, but many are not prepared to abandon the countries that gave them refuge in their time of need, nor should they be forced to make such a decision. DACA and TPS, temporary protected status for Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, was terminated effective May 21st, 2017. Deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, is being dismantled by the current administration. Many immigrants, Liberians included, are adversely affected by the decision to end legal status, especially children who have known no other home than the United States of America. You have heard the appeals and protests to reinstate TPS and DACA. I add my voice to the chorus of immigrants, highlighting the plight of thousands of law-abiding Liberians who have contributed to the economy of this country and call the USA home. Please, find a path to legal residence that will keep families united and offer students the opportunity to continue their education in the schools in which they are currently enrolled. A house with two rooms. The final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, of Liberia Diaspora Project documents the experience of human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law that forced Liberians to leave the country. The Staten Island Liberian Community Association and Staten Island-based African Refuge supported the work of the Advocates for Human Rights to document this dark time in Liberian history. Based on analyses of more than 1,600 statements, interviews, and witness testimonies, the TRC report tells the stories of trauma experienced by members of the diaspora during the flight through Liberia and across international borders and in resettlement in the United States and United Kingdom. My father was among those who walked for days, sometimes sleeping under open skies to escape warring factions. His home was taken over by rebels. Even after he found his way out of Liberia and into the United States, he continued to suffer the recollection of atrocities. The awful ramifications of Alzheimer's disease did not curb his desire to return to his home that he was forced to leave by rebel combatants. While many in the diaspora will attribute the beginning of Liberia's civil crises to the 1979 riots, I believe that there were many telling signs before April 1979. Poverty, political dominance, corruption, tribalism, and low literacy were significant contributors. Those political landmines did not begin in 1979. The same themes were present in interviews and witness testimonies from members of the diaspora. The themes persist today and reared their ugly heads when I spoke informally to members of the community as I prepared for this testimony. The Civil War has left entrenched resentments and divisions along tribal and political lines, evident in the diaspora and ever present in current campaign rhetoric. There is no quick solution to problems resulting from more than 100 years of dysfunction in government and social practices. The TRC report was a necessary start. Ignoring the TRC report adds fuel to the fire and buffers the rhetoric of many who believe there is no room at the table for them. So for many, It's time to turn the table upside down. We cannot and must not allow stagnation to steer us backwards. Liberians on Staten Island and across the diaspora recognize the need for reconciliation and healing the wounds of the Liberian nation. When President Johnson Sirleaf inaugurated the TRC, she said, "Our country cannot continue to evade justice and the protection of human rights throughout our land, especially of the kind that restores our historical place among civilized nations. Our government will ensure that those culpable of the commission of crimes against humanity will face up to their crimes no matter when, where, or how. The current government has not dealt decisively with the TRC report, so the next government elected in October or November 2017 must chart a transparent course of action. The TRC report will not fade away into oblivion. No one disputes the findings, even though 2 commissioners did not sign the report because of undocumented dissenting views. The Liberian government must determine if it will implement all or some of the recommendations. A new commission must be inaugurated to provide a timetable for implementation. The new TRC must have the benefit of using the investigative body that prepared the report as a resource. The mandate to develop a plausible plan for dealing with the recommendation made almost 8 years ago must be front and center in the first 100 days of the next government. Rethinking governance with heart and mind. Liberians in the diaspora agree that rebuilding the physical and human capital must be top priorities for the next government. The close links between infrastructure development, education, agriculture, and healthcare are indisputable. There is no substitute for establishing desired goals and planning for how one will achieve those goals. Simplistic as it may sound, planning works. We call on the next government to share the 1-year, 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year plans for 4 key areas: infrastructure development, education, agriculture, and healthcare. Integrated in the plans must be measures of accountability and quality control. If it is not working, the government must be prepared to revise the plan to ensure that the established goals are achieved. The socioeconomic schisms in Liberia are more pronounced today than they were 12 years ago. How do we know that? Follow the money. Money transfer companies are sending large sums of money from the diaspora to support families in Liberia. But transfers are also going in the other direction, from Liberia to banking institutions overseas. Please explain to me how it is possible for anyone employed by the world's 3rd poorest nation to legally amass enough wealth to build homes locally, buy homes overseas, and still have change to spare. I call on this committee to ensure that pressure is brought to bear on the government of Liberia to institute systems that prevent and prosecute corruption at all levels. In my other life, I would tell exam proctors, your job is to prevent cheating, not to catch cheaters. Similarly so, the government of Liberia must make it difficult for corruption to persist, and when corruption is uncovered, effective prosecution must send a strong message that a government for, of, and by the people will not stand by idly while the people are disenfranchised.
Thank you, Dr. Curtis. We're going to take up the rest. We're going to enter the rest of your testimony into the official record and take up some of those issues during the question and answer period.
I apologize. And
No, that's okay. You're very passionate about this. Thank you, Dr. Curtis. We're going to take a pause for a moment. Chairman Royce has another hearing that he has to attend, so the chair recognizes Chairman Royce.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. You know, we've got a very long history of ties to Liberia going back to July 26 of 1847. We know it's July 26 because that's Greg Simpkins' birthday here. And he's a staff director, and he and I have worked on Liberian issues since the 90s. And so there have been some disappointments. We were trying to get information into Liberia so that in her first race, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, when was that, 97? 1997 so that she could compete with Charles Taylor in the election. But he controlled all of the media, and as a consequence, of course, he won. We were very disappointed, as you can imagine, afterwards to see what happened in Liberia with the mutilations and the murder rate and everything that transpired not only there, but in neighboring Sierra Leone. For a while, one of the young men who worked in my office, he was a survivor. He lost both of his parents. He was from Sierra Leone, but he lost both of his parents to an attack by the Revolutionary United Front. And that group, of course, had been supported, again, by Charles Taylor. So it was a very bad time for West Africa. When I chaired the Africa Subcommittee, we worked very diligently across party lines to send a clear, unified message, and that was that Charles Taylor needed to be brought to the bar of justice. And against the odds, he was. We have a respite here. And in the meantime, years later, we've seen some impressive growth in Liberia. I've been out to Liberia and seen a number of the steps that are being taken, and I got to tell you, the U.S. has invested there to rebuild and support democratic institutions. And as a nation confronted with immense political and economic and, of course, security and development challenges, Liberia has persevered. And I would just take for a moment the time to say that, in my view, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has been leading these efforts, and I commend her strong leadership through 2 terms, but she's stepping down from office, and I think this is admirable because she's setting an example for other African leaders now in terms of stepping down and giving an opportunity for the next person to run for president in an open election. I think those elections provide an opportunity to consolidate these democratic gains. It's a peaceful transfer of power. If done successfully, Liberia will be a model to fledgling democracies across Africa. And on that, I want to thank the members of this committee, because I think the members here, your continued interest in this, your efforts to help this along will have very, very consequential impacts. As we look forward, I see Al White's in the audience, by the way. He caught my eye when I came in here. He's the former chief investigator of the Sierra Leone Special Court. And again, for those of you who have kept this interest, you know, for a generation, it's important. A steady hand of assistance here is important. The fact that the Liberian diaspora community, the American Liberian community is so involved is a huge asset to the people of Liberia. So as we look ahead to future engagement, we all recognize one thing, and that is that deep reforms are needed to further address corruption. In Liberia, just as like the rest of the world, this is something that has to be confronted. And a more conducive environment for trade and for business investment is really needed. So we here in the United States have got to remain a willing partner to support this transition of power where the will of the people is respected and upheld and beyond, so that our country, the ancestral home of many Americans, our country and Liberia can together continue to push for this hopeful track. We have a special responsibility here as Americans. And for the Liberian American community here, thank you again for your engagement. Let's try to be clear-eyed. Let's make certain that there's accountability. Let's make certain we're on the ground in order to check in terms of the elections. I'm meeting here momentarily with the head of IRI and NDI. We've got to make sure, you know, that all these steps are taken, and that we want to continue to help with the reforms, and we insist on the inclusion of the Liberian American community. Thank you very much for the time here, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll resume with opening statements, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Nakardian for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, I deeply appreciate this opportunity to discuss the evolution of Liberia's democracy. With generous backing from US aid and international partners, IFAS supports credible electoral processes globally. In many parts of the world, including Liberia, IFAS works with its partners in the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening, the International Republican Institute, and the National Democratic Institute. Mr. Chairman, credible elections strengthen peace and democracy. This is no truer than in Liberia. 12 years ago, with the 2005 elections, Liberia was emerging from a civil war, a war that left hundreds of thousands dead, disabled, or displaced, a war rife with the use of child soldiers, and an epidemic of violence against women. The 2005 elections shattered a double glass ceiling, leading to the first elected female head of state in Africa and the first black woman head of state, Her Excellency Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. On October 10, 2017, Liberians will recommit to democracy. As Johnson Sirleaf is ineligible to run for a third term and should be congratulated for honoring her country's constitutional term limits, this election will mark the first democratic transfer of political power in Liberian history. IFAS has implemented election programs in Liberia since 2004. Over time, our work has become more focused and nuanced. In 2005, Liberia's National Election Commission, known as the NEC, relied heavily on the UN peacekeeping mission and IFAS. In 2011, it began standing independently. In 2014, in the midst of the Ebola crisis, the NEC ably conducted special senatorial elections. This is progress, and relied on IFAS's support in several key areas, such as voter registration, results management, campaign finance, and electoral dispute resolution. Mr. Chairman, our efforts are yielding results. A recent survey found that 91% of Liberians feel free to choose whom to vote for, while 90% feel free to join any political organization. The NEC increased its voters register from 2014 to 2017 by 15% to 2 million registered voters. With IFAS support, the NEC registered 67% of young voters. A 2017 US aid-funded study found that the majority of Liberians interviewed trust the NEC as an impartial and transparent body. In sum, without US support, the Commission would be weaker, less prepared for the elections, less voters would be registered, and less would know about the process, and the October elections in Liberia would be more expensive. For instance, the government of Liberia assessed the viability of biometric voter registration for the upcoming elections. IFAS advised against its implementation prior to the coming elections, citing cost and logistical reasons. The government agreed with our assessment and did not attempt a premature or rushed implementation of new, untested technology. This is a clear example of how mutual trust, built over time, and adherence to local context leads to cost-effective and practical decisions that can stave off electoral mishaps. Despite this progress, the NEC faces several challenges. Liberia's road network, already unreliable, will lengthen the delivery and retrieval of electoral materials, especially during the height of rainy season. The core of election officials still depend on continued international support for both planning and implementation. A runoff election is a highly likely scenario. The NEC will have 2 weeks after the announcement of the first round results for administering a runoff. This will strain their systems. These challenges highlight the continued need for assistance, which brings me, Mr. Chairman, to my recommendations for the US Congress. Firstly, I thank the US Congress for its robust, bipartisan funding of democracy assistance and ask for its continued support. Electoral assistance, as evidenced in with Liberia's success, should start early and continue through the post-election period to allow for flexible and responsive programming. Multi-year, multi-election programs are the most impactful. In Liberia, we recommend continued support to a possible constitutional referendum, to the eventual introduction of biometric voter identification and registration, and to the strengthening of judicial capacities. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for this opportunity to testify. The October 2017 elections will be a landmark achievement for Liberians, and we congratulate them in advance. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Dr. Fomunya.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bass, distinguished members of the subcommittee, On behalf of the National Democratic Institute, NDI, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss prospects for advancing democracy and good governance in Liberia following next month's elections. I focus on the elections because how they are conducted will have significant impact on the legitimacy of the ensuing government and legislature and the performance of governance institutions. On October 10th, Liberians will go to the polls to elect a president, vice president, and 73 members of the House of Representatives. There are 20 presidential and vice presidential tickets and approximately 1,000 candidates for seats in the House of Representatives. Since 2003, NDI has, with funding from the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Swedish government, worked to strengthen the development of democratic institutions and practices in Liberia. To support Liberian efforts to conduct credible polls in 2017, NDI deployed 2 pre-election assessment missions to Monrovia in February and September, currently has long-term observers and analysts in country, and will deploy an international election observation mission for the October polls. The Institute is also providing technical assistance to a coalition of civil society organizations, the Elections Coordinating Committee, that plans to deploy thousands of citizen observers to monitor the polls across all 15 counties of the country. Furthermore, NDI is training party poll watchers from all political parties on how to enhance transparency by monitoring all aspects of voting on behalf of their candidates and collecting evidence from polling stations to use in the electoral disputes resolution process should the outcome of the polls be contested. Liberia has enjoyed a continuous period of 14 years of peace since the end of armed conflict in 2003, and citizens aspire to building a resilient democracy that delivers for its people. The upcoming elections will mark an historic milestone for the country as they present an opportunity for the first peaceful transfer of power from one elected president to another since 1944. According to recent focus groups undertaken by NDI, Liberians are enthusiastic about the elections and have faith in their ability to determine the outcome. They hope that candidates and political parties present policy proposals during the ongoing campaign so citizens can make informed choices. Recent focus group research also underscored the fact that Liberians embrace democracy not only as a means to end conflict, but also as a governance model that fosters accountability so governing institutions can deliver on citizens' expectations. Should elected leaders be unable to satisfy these expectations, citizens may lose faith in democracy and further disengage from the political process, hence reinforcing apathy and stalling the country's democratic progress. With the election campaign underway, Liberians repeatedly stated to NDI observers that they, and I quote, do not want their communities to revert to the armed conflicts of decades past. The future of democracy in Liberia would hinge, in the short term, on the perceived success or failure of the October polls, and in the long term, on the ability of future leaders to consolidate the gains that have been made in the last decade in improving governance and meeting citizens' demands. If voters have confidence that the electoral process is fair and credible, and that their collective will is reflected in the outcome, that would go a long way in laying the foundation for greater stability, peace, and sustainable development. In my full written statement, I discuss in more detail the electoral process and future prospects in the post-election period with regards to specific entities and issues, notably the executive and legislative branches of government, security sector performance, civil society, decentralization, and the rule of law. I would like to submit that full statement as well as the September 9th statement issued by NDI's pre-election assessment mission. For the record, I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, all of you, for your opening statements. I'll take a few moments to ask some questions, and then Ranking Member Bass will ask our questions. Mr. Peterson, there's an international polling organization, it may have been Afrobarometer, that reported that Liberians have more faith in the National Election Commission and this election than they have in the past. Is there anything to attribute that confidence in? Has anything changed that we could get confidence in our own election process?
Well, I think the Commission has had some time to improve its operations. IFAS, of course, has been working very closely with them for some years now. The Afrobarometer poll, as you note, a couple years ago was finding that only about a third of Liberians had, significant trust in the Electoral Commission. But from what our partners are telling us now, people are pretty confident that the Commission can do its job. But I think there's been a lot that's been invested in the Commission. It's got, decent independent leadership, and that makes a big difference.
Thank you. Dr. Curtis, that you beautiful young lady from Staten Island who went back to Liberia, suffered from that great loss, the accident in which she was denied medical care. Is that the norm, Aurelia? Is that what happens to people in Liberia who can't pay for medical care? And is there anything that our country is doing about that?
I think there is a lot that the United States of America is doing about it. United States of America has been a good friend to Liberia. The development of Liberia over the last 12 years would not have been possible without the friendship and the support of the United States of America, the government, the institutions here, the USAID. But we have a broken system. We have a broken healthcare system that requires quite a bit. We have a broken education system. And as I said in my statement, while the last 12 years of governance have been a great foundation that we can build on, there's still much to be done. Infrastructure development, education, healthcare reform, and paying attention to agriculture, which is what most Liberians know how to do, are going to be key challenges for the next government. There's so much at stake in this next election. And as a Liberian in diaspora, I'm grateful that Liberia has the United States as a partner in this and as a guide to help with establishing accountability and in areas that we are not historically good at.
Your advocacy for dual citizenship, the Liberians back in Liberia, would they welcome American Liberians going there and participating in the election process, or would they feel that there's an interference from outside sources if more and more people were involved with dual citizenship?
I've heard arguments on both sides, but I tell you, Congressman, that in this election, there is evidence that there are at least 2 candidates that have said they have citizenship in other countries. So will Liberians welcome them? We'll see how the votes are cast. Neither of actually one of them is a leading candidate. So will Liberians welcome them? Let's see how the votes are cast. But I think it's a well-known fact in Liberia that several members of the Liberian government and at least 2 candidates in the current elections have citizenship in other countries. But the Alien Law, Chapter 22, says that doesn't exist, and it's illegal.
Mr. Dr. Dean, I was just wondering if you could tell us about how again, talking about confidence. I think in your testimony, it's about 54% of Liberian voters believe that the national elections back in 2011 were free and complete and fair. And I think in 2014, 3 years later, that was up to 78%. Again, what inspires this confidence? Mr. Peterson was telling me about the commission. What inspires this confidence that the Liberians have in the election process that in such a short period of time it increased so dramatically?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the one thing that one could very specifically point to is running an election during a crisis. 2014 elections happened during the Ebola crisis, and the Commission managed to very ably navigate a very complex time to manage that election. And that's a direct testimony to how ordinary citizens respond to credible elections. A process happening under crisis, ably maneuvered. I think that could most clearly demonstrate where that change has come from.
And my last question before I turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Fumanyo. There are many concerns about voter registration, the timeliness. We heard in the first panel about the rainy season now and the timeliness of the elections. And Dr. Curtis had noted that perhaps even the qualifications of some of the candidates who hold American citizenship or citizenship from other countries may be a factor in when people are voting. Do you anticipate that some of these issues are going to have serious impact on the elections next month? And what is your opinion on
that? Mr. Chairman, having just returned from Liberia as part of the pre-election assessment mission, the NDI delegation raised these issues with the Election Commission, with the political leaders, as well as with representatives of Liberian civil society organizations. There was a sense that the registration period did allow for Liberians of voting age, eligible voters, to register. There was a voter verification period during which the initial registry was made available so that citizens could verify that their names were properly recorded on the voter rolls. And now the Election Commission is in the process of finalizing the voter registry. The Commission has promised to make that final voter registry available to political parties so that they will be able to verify in time. I think we were told by September 15th that that final list will be available to political parties so they can begin the process of verifying to make sure that all of their supporters that are of voting age and that did participate in the voter registration process will be on the voter rolls. Of course, with every election, you cannot anticipate in advance the issues that will come up, but we will be looking very keenly to see if any Liberians that were voting age and that were properly registered didn't find their names on the voter rolls or were disenfranchised because of any shortcomings on the part of the Election Commission or on the part of the poll workers.
Thank you very much. I yield to the ranking member, Ms. Bass.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to say a few things before asking questions, and wanted to begin with Mr. Peterson. You cited in your comments, you ran through a number of countries that have had peaceful transfers of power. And I think it's important to note that because we often focus on those countries that don't have a peaceful transition. And I think after the next year, when all is said and done over all of the elections that have taken place over the continent, the vast majority are going to be a peaceful transfer of power. And I think we need to keep that in mind. I always think it's important in the United States that we begin to look at the continent of Africa differently, and as opposed to a land of problems, but a land of opportunities. I also wanted to mention in terms of Liberia, because we keep making references to the connections between the United States and Liberia. And I, first of all, feel that connection personally, considering that when the country of Liberia was established, it was in conjunction with enslaved African Americans, and for all I know, some of my ancestors could have been on those boats going back to Liberia, but since the average African American has no idea where their families come from or what happened to their families, to me there is a personal connection, and I think as our country begins to reconcile with our history, we need to acknowledge that the Americans that went over to Liberia were enslaved African Americans. So I wanted to first ask Dr. Curtis, because you mentioned DACA and you mentioned TPS, and I was wondering what is happening with the diaspora. I do have to extend to you, as well as to our presiding chairperson, the opportunity to come next Friday to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation African Brain Trust, where Johnson Sirleaf will be there. And we'll make sure that you have that information, because perhaps folks from Staten Island, it's not that far, might want to come and attend the event and see their president make some comments the last time in the United States before she leaves office, or one of the last times anyway. I'm sure she'll be attending other events, and I know there's one that takes place a few days later. But I wanted to know if you could talk about what is going on amongst the diaspora community regarding DACA as well as TPS, which did expire. So what does that mean? Your microphone.
I'll address DACA first. The dismantling of that protection for children is unfortunate, and as an educator who serviced a large immigrant community on Staten Island, I understand the fear that now exists with families, because it took some convincing for us in the Liberian community, in the education community, to convince families that it's okay. You should go ahead and apply for DACA.
Right.
Now, these families have outed themselves and put themselves at extreme risk at a time when that protection has been snatched away. In the case of TPS, United States of America has opened its doors, as I said, to Liberians in a time of great need. And even as Liberia has made great strides in reestablishing democracy, there are many reasons why families need to continue to live here in the United States, and TPS offered them that legal status. Having it terminated on May 21st, again, put many families into hiding again.
Yeah, what does that mean? Because since it expired, are they subject to deportation? Can ICE pass by, since they're also outed as well? I mean, is there a list that ICE could essentially go pick everybody up whose TPS has expired?
I believe ICE has access to all of the information for people who filed for TPS, and if they decided that they wanted to do a roundup, that they could. I hope they don't, but people who applied for TPS believed in the system that was providing them legal status, and that system now has terminated that legal status. And so these were all law-abiding citizens. Criminals don't go and register with the government. So these were all, unless they're forced to, but these were all law-abiding citizens who were working in this country and now don't have that. And I'm not sure that the systems in Liberia are prepared to absorb any mass migration back to Liberia.
Do you know what the numbers are?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I will research them and let Congressman...
Between DACA and TPS, I think it would be important to know what the numbers are.
Congressman Donovan's office.
Thank you, and you should know that we are working on it. So I am hopeful that we will come to a resolution around DACA, and I'm hopeful that we'll come to a resolution around TPS. My fear, though, is that how long that's going to take us. Sometimes it takes us a long time to act, but we can act quickly. We can, and I'm hopeful that we will. Let me, I'm sorry?
That's what we're praying for you in that regard.
Yes, absolutely. But I wanted to talk now about, or ask some questions of our next two panelists about the election, and just a couple of points. One, I wanted to know is the election just one day? As I mentioned, I participated as an observer in the election in Kenya, and it was one day, but it was a national holiday, so everybody had the day off, and the polls were open from 6 to 5 in the evening. And then in Kenya, there was the full observation mission. So, you know, there was NDI, there was the AU, the EU, the Carter Center, ECOWAS, and I'm wondering if it will be a full-blown observation mission as it was in Kenya. For either of you.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, elections will be one day. Polls will be open on the 10th of October, and I think people will be very interested to see how quickly the election result actually comes back. As far as we understand, and my colleague from NDI will talk more about that, there are full-blown delegations from all the major observer missions. This is one of the top 5 elections that will be watched on the African continent, following Kenya, Rwanda, and there are already groups from the Carter Center, long-term observer groups, NDI has been there, and the European Union has also been on the ground working with domestic observer groups as well.
You know, and perhaps before you answer, you know, Dr. Curtis raised the issue that one of the leading candidates, his citizenship is questionable, and I just wonder, especially given what happened in Kenya, which was shocking to me, you know, with the Supreme Court, and I'm just wondering if this issue is a part of the campaign. When you were there?
When I was there, our delegation met with all of the top candidates, and the issue was not raised directly with our delegation. But we also were informed that in recent months, the Election Commission, as well as the Supreme Court, has made some rulings that have been diversely interpreted by different segments of the Liberian population. And we make reference to that issue in our delegation statement. If I could also answer on the delegations, that NDI will be fielding a full-blown delegation. We regret very much that you will not be able to provide the leadership that you provided on the Kenya delegation.
Thank you.
But we're going to take a second chance with your schedule for November, because it's a very strong likelihood that there will be a runoff election, given that there are 20 presidential candidates, and there's an estimation that none of the candidates would be able to obtain 50% plus 1 vote in the first round.
Do they have the date for the final? Or?
They don't have the date yet, but it's likely going to be at some point in early November.
Okay.
We'll check with your staff.
Please.
Certainly. But we know that the Carter Center is going to field an international delegation. The European Union will send an international delegation, as well as the African Union and the ECOWAS, which is the sub-regional entity for West African states. Could I just add one last comment with regards to your observation, Congresswoman Bass, on what has happened with political leadership in Africa in the past few years, and to underscore the fact that when you look at West Africa, which is ECOWAS, that of the 15 countries that currently make up West Africa, 14 of them have had a renewal of political leadership through the ballot box in elections that have been accepted by the citizens of those countries, as well as the international community, as credible and free and fair. And in those 14 countries, 14 of the 15 heads of states are serving their second term at the highest, and none of them has exceeded the constitutional mandate that's required in most of those countries. So when you look at the continent, West Africa has really made tremendous progress with regards to the ability of renewing political leadership through meaningful and credible elections.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I don't know, Mr. Peterson, if you'd like to have any concluding comments.
Well, I will just echo Chris's comments about West Africa. I think it really has become a bastion of democracy. That's not to underestimate the serious problems that they have, you know, corruption, the insecurity. But I think that we in the United States would do well to pay a lot more attention to it. Democracy in many other parts of the world is under a lot of pressure, but I think we can be inspired by what's going on in West Africa.
Oh, we need to pay attention to it, huh? Is that what you just said? Thank you.
Well, I thank all of the panelists for their insight, their expertise in sharing their thoughts with us. I thank my friend from California, Ms. Bass, for her participation, Chairman Royce and Chairman Smith. Without objection, all witnesses' full statements will be entered into the record of this hearing, and this hearing is now adjourned. Let me go see my friends. Great, thank you.